Will we leave that question?
Yeah.
Right. Second one. Is political criticism in retreat?
Is political criticism in retreat? That's a difficult question too, and it's bound up with the relationship between politics and criticism, as well as the notion of being in retreat. In 1983, Terry Eagleton published a book called Literary Theory, an Introduction. It's a great little book. It's really literary theory and obituary, because it ends with a chapter entitled Political Criticism. That's the solution, if you like, the antidote to literary theory, which is too introverted, which is too text-based and so on. Political criticism is interested in those big questions of social class, state, revolution, nation, that really matter. But what that political criticism is, and what counts as politics, is complicated. Since 1983, you might say there are many areas of life that would count as political, and without resorting to the cliche, everything is political, therefore all criticism is political. You could say, is there a form of criticism which can now be seen to be in retreat, which would be political criticism of a particular kind, concerned with grand narratives, concerned with institutions, concerned with state politics or party politics, big issues, war, empire, nation, and so on? That I'm not so sure about. People might have become wary of particular forms of discourse, particular kinds of rhetoric around criticism. You know, galvanising, motivating, polemical rhetoric. So there might be a shift in the kind of language of criticism, if you like, because people might become... This would be an argument to say somebody like Derrida might have advanced in the 1980s. The idea that criticism itself, you know, the language was changing, the context was changing. I think developments in approaches to... Tell me why. What would be key? Stop that. So is political criticism in retreat? That question can only mean there's something called political criticism, which at the moment, because of things that are happening institutionally or politically in the world or in academia and higher education, it is more difficult to present criticism of the type that would be seen to be political in the 1960s, 1970s or 1980s. Is political criticism in retreat? I think political criticism has been overtaken or superseded, not because we now have something which is not political criticism, but because our notion of what political criticism was in the 1980s, that it was about state formation, that it was about nationalism, that it was about social class or empire, war. I think that changed quite a bit because of new forms of criticism that come in. So I think, without resorting to the cliche that says all criticism is political or everything's political, which I think has some truth in it, but without resorting to that, I think there's been a change in the way that we conceive the rhetoric, polemics, the language of criticism, if you like, has changed. And now people are interested in more subtle and nuanced ideas of what politics might be, what might count as political, and I could give examples of that. But yeah, I think gender and sexuality, ethnicity, you might say those are still gender, race and class, the big three important issues, but I think politics has become a much broader a concept, a much broader idea. So political criticism is not in retreat, except in that narrow sense that the conventional politically engaged activist criticism of the 1980s has been overtaken by other ways of thinking about politics. So in that sense, I don't think you might say political criticism is in advance or has advanced over the last 30 years or so. And we have to remind ourselves that when we talk about criticism, we're not talking here about scientific theory or developments in physics, for example. Criticism tend to mean literary criticism or literary theory or even historicist literary criticism, still within the realm of literature. That kind of criticism, which had a big eye, it had a conceit of itself in the 1980s, it had a big opinion of itself in the 1980s, and I think that's maybe just been, that's come down a little bit, and there's a sense that criticism is more modest in its aims. There's a line that Derrida came out with about 40 years ago, and it was to say that he thought what was really revolutionary was to tamper with language, and to change the way people thought about language, and to home in on details and work out those details. That was more interesting and more subversive than grand claims to be changing culture and society with a sentence or with a declaration. And I think there's some truth in that. As I say, when Terry Eagleton published Literary Theory in 1983, his concluding passage, his concluding chapter to Literary Theory in 1983, Terry Eagleton titled it Political Criticism. And that was the idea that political criticism in 1983 was the antidote to the theorising, the introverted theorising that had preceded it post-1968, post-structuralism, deconstruction and so on. This was the claim that something called political criticism would bring us all into the daylight and into the hands-on kind of critique that was needed to, the pragmatics that was needed to change society, to change culture and so on. I thought that was a brilliant book, especially in its summarising of other literary theories, but I never quite got what political criticism was supposed to be, and I think in some ways it was, although the book was designed to be an obituary for literary theory, in some ways it was an obituary for political criticism of the kind that Eagleton championed. It had a great deal of promissory rhetoric about it and sort of grand claims, but that language of grand narratives and big claims and changing things tomorrow, I think it's history in some ways is bound up with a certain part of the British left in some ways, but I think it was those grand claims were dying on their feet at that time, and I think now there's a much more diverse, varied, contested notion of what political criticism would be or could be.
What new directions do you see for criticism of the early modern period?
I think there are a variety of new directions. One direction that I've been interested in myself, and a piece of work that I did recently, was what I call agricultural materialism, which is a play on cultural materialism as championed and developed by Raymond Williams, but looking at something specific, looking at how husbandry in a colonial context, farming methods in a colonial context, agriculture in a colonial context was key to the advancement of empire. The colonies provided, if you like, a testing ground, a laboratory, a tabula rasa, a blank space, a field within which agriculturalists could experiment and innovate. And I think historically Ireland in the 16th century and the 17th century was one of those colonial spaces where agriculturalists were allowed to innovate and experiment and pioneer, and those pioneering farming methods moved from Ireland across to Virginia to the British colonial America. And I think so that's an interest of mine, where I'm looking at culture, but in that broader sense, and one of its other meanings to cultivate, looking at agriculture. So that's one area of interest. I'm not the only person interested in husbandry or farming in the early modern period, and how that relates to pastoral poetry and to poetic imagery of land spaces and so on, land holdings and indeed of farming practices. So that's one area in which there's an interest. I think there's another area which might not be seen as a new direction, and that is empire, because what I've just been speaking about is interest in empire, but I think empire was really a driver behind so much human activity in the period and affected so much human activity in the period that I think we've not yet done it justice. We've not yet looked at the extent to which empire underpinned so much activity. One of the reasons for that is because Victorianists and modernists were much better at accounting for empire, at examining empire. So empire was always thought of as something that started later than the early modern period. Empire proper, as it might be called, was an 18th century phenomenon. The high point of empire was 19th century. And empire and Victorianism are kind of bound up together. So I think we're getting to a stage now where there's greater awareness of the pervasiveness of colonial concerns in the early modern period. So I think that's one of the shifts. And another area, of course, is something like medical humanities, or an interest in the sciences and medicine, and how a lot of these modern developments had their roots in the 16th and 17th century. You could add, of course, that they had their roots in the 16th and 17th century, often in colonial contexts, because again, the colonies were the sites of experimentation and saw the development of, for example, battlefield surgery led to developments in medicine and surgery more general. But this was happening on the battlefield, which tended to be a bit, as it were, in the colonies. So I think developments in medicine and science and agriculture were bound up with empire, and I think interest now in those, the early development of the human sciences, if you like, is key to some of those new developments in the period.